It's the Hawkeyes and the Buckeyes from the shoe out in Columbus. The Hawkeyes trying to channel that spark from 2017 and flush what happened 2 years ago out there, a beatdown at the hands of Ohio State during that awful offensive year led by Spencer Petras, Brian Ferentz, and company. We'll talk about keys to the game in just one moment. But first, want to thank our sponsor, Under the Kitchen. Randy has just sparked a deal, speaking of sparks, with Caleb Johnson, the Iowa Star running back. Check it out. All of Randy's authentic Hawkeye artwork available in signed and unsigned prints. They make for great souvenirs, maybe a gift for a close Hawkeye friend or family member. Check it all out. Under the Kitchen on Facebook. You can also visit underthekitchen.square.site. That's underthekitchen.square.site. So the Hawkeyes and the Buckeyes this Saturday doing business on CBS should be quite a matchup. Iowa trying to, again, flush what happened in 2022. If you remember that game, that was in the midst of maybe Iowa's worst offensive year in the history of the program. The numbers were right down there. Really, the last 3 seasons prior to 24 were right in that company. But I digress. Iowa just struggled. We know Joe Evans had the amazing strip sack, fumble recovery, and scoop and score for a touchdown in that game, but it mattered not. Spencer Petras came out, first play from scrimmage, threw it right to an Ohio State defender, and that really set the tone for the rest of the game. And in spite of a really good Iowa defense that ended up getting that offensively challenged team to 8 wins, the Hawkeyes really struggled to keep pace in the long haul. Can they keep pace this weekend? I think they can, and here's why. I'll start with quarterback. Now, this is something that I think everything has to be put in perspective and given with context. Will Howard is a very good quarterback, all right? His numbers are excellent. The reason I think this is potentially an area where Iowa can take advantage of Ohio State in some regards, when you're looking for a possible chink in the armor, it might be the fact that Ohio State historically, including under Ryan Day, they've had mobile quarterbacks. Although CJ Stroud didn't run a lot, except against Georgia, he was able to run, and he was always going to be the threat to run. Teams knew that he was still a dual threat guy who was really athletic and had the ability to gain ground with his feet. Justin Fields, Braxton Miller, Terrell Pryor. Cardale Jones wasn't real mobile. I don't think Iowa ever actually faced off against Cardale Jones. JT Barrett's another one. They've always had these mobile guys. Will Howard can run, but he's not as mobile. I think Iowa's defensive line and that linebacking core could have a little bit of an advantage on that Ohio State offensive line that is young in places, and maybe you can key up some very well-timed pressure on Will Howard. You got to be very, very careful about how and when you blitz, but Phil Parker, best DC in the country, I think he'll channel the right times, figure out the right moments to send some extra pressure. And hey, if you can get your front four to get home, Deontay Craig looked like he took a step forward in the first half against Minnesota. We've seen Aaron Graves flash this year, maybe Ethan Hurkett, Max Llewellyn, Wyatt Black, somebody along that defensive line. Maybe it's Brian Allen coming off the bench. If they can get some pressure on a guy who's less mobile than we're used to seeing out of an Ohio State quarterback, that could really help the case, because it's going to be hard to get Ohio State behind the chains. It's hard to mess up their timing offensively, but if you can maybe get a couple tackles for loss, a sack or two early, get them off balance, that would be a start. How about these 3 factors? Ohio State has not yet really been tested. They played at Michigan State last week. Michigan State led by a first-year head coach. I thought Michigan State actually played Ohio State relatively even during parts of that game. What's insane about that game is Ohio State was +2 on turnovers, and Michigan State turned it over twice in the red zone and had a turnover on downs in the red zone. Very, very sloppy. Ohio State beat Michigan State 52% to 20% critical downs. That's 3rd down and 4th down combined conversion rate. And how about this? Rushing the football, Ohio State 185 on the ground versus 47 for Michigan State. And if you do the math, 5.3 yards per carry for the Buckeyes, 1.9 for the Spartans. But really, I go back to the turnovers. I know turnovers are a part of the game, and credit Ohio State for forcing a couple of those, but you can't turn the ball over 3 times in the red zone and expect to win against maybe the best team in the country. So they've played relatively clean football. Typically, Iowa has maybe a bugaboo or two early in the year, a couple hiccups with penalties. they've been pretty clean here of late. They've been clean, not turning the ball over. Iowa's backs, in spite of the fact that they really relied on Caleb Johnson, Jazz Patterson, Kamari Moulton earlier in the year, even LaShawn Williams for a few carries. They've not really fumbled the ball. They've not put the ball up for grabs. That's positive. Protect that football. They got a chance to at least compete on the ground. Ohio State's going to be the biggest challenge Iowa's faced to this point defensively with that defensive front. But the more I talk to different people, including Mark Rogers, the voice of college football, we spoke with a couple of his contributors over on his channels. And it sounds like if there's a weak spot for Ohio State, it might be at linebacker. So maybe Iowa can continue to ride Caleb Johnson. Now, is he going to be able to take on 20 to 30 carries? He's coming off a bye week, so maybe he will. I don't know if by year's end he'll be able to continue dealing with that many carries. But if Iowa can continue to get the production out of Caleb Johnson, big plus. I actually think you can look elsewhere other than just the run game. Now, both these teams are very productive offensively in rush yards per game. They both rank very high nationally in rush defense. So obviously that's the category everybody's looking at, like who's going to win the rushing battle. But honestly, I think it may come down to something else. And here's what I think. Iowa making a couple of big plays through the air. Now, Hawkeye fans may not like hearing that because they don't have a lot of faith that Iowa can do it. But I even suggested earlier today and yesterday during my conversation with Mark that maybe Ohio State play a little bit safer, not load up to stop the run, but just make sure that you're giving up nothing on the back end. If Iowa's one-dimensional with a run game that's semi-effective to effective, I don't know if that's enough against this Ohio State team, including a dynamic offense. Now, maybe it's closer than you'd like as a Buckeye fan, but I think if you load up against Caleb Johnson, you run the risk of Iowa hitting a play or two deep down the field, and maybe that's enough to turn the tide and give Iowa a lead early, and then maybe you're playing with your hand behind your back. If I'm an Iowa fan, I am fine with Ohio State loading up to stop the run. Maybe they can strike magic in a bottle. And hey, Tim Lester talked last week about a couple of plays he had ready for Minnesota, did not run them. We're talking about man beaters, shots down the field. I would think if he's going to run them at all, he's going to run them against the best team on the schedule, Ohio State. Now, speaking of big plays, Ohio State's got a receiver in Jeremiah Smith, who is an absolute stud as a freshman, had a couple unbelievable catches last week. He is your 2024 version of Jackson Smith and Jigba, Marvin Harrison Jr., Chris Olave, whoever you want to use as an example. They also used Devin Brown a little bit last week at quarterback. He threw one of the touchdowns to Jeremiah Smith, so they're not afraid to use multiple quarterbacks. They're obviously really good at running back. Trevion Henderson is a Doak Walker Award candidate, but they got several guys they're using. It's going to be really a two-headed system there at running back for Ohio State against Iowa. And speaking of big plays as well, the Iowa defense has given up some big plays early in the year. I think that may actually, this sounds like reverse logic, but that may actually be to Iowa's advantage because it's given them an off week to really tighten things up and get them out of your system early. I think Iowa's defense proved a year ago that they can give up some big plays during non-conference play, turn the corner to October, and be one of the best big play defenses in the country. That's what they did last year. So the fact that they gave up some early this year does not actually concern me all that much. I actually think that Phil Parker will have these guys ready against the best explosive play offense in the country. And let's keep in mind, not only is Iowa coming off a bye week in which Tim Lester is the offensive coordinator, this is the first time we've seen Iowa with a bye week with a new OC, but Ohio State's coming off a game, and they got a big game next week against Oregon. They take a trip out to Eugene to play a team that's maybe going to be the eventual opponent for the Buckeyes in Indianapolis in the Big Ten championship game. Oregon, Ohio State projected preseason to be the two best teams in this conference. So I know I just gave you a lot. Pressure Will Howard if at all possible. Keep Jeremiah Smith in front of you, which will be a priority for Phil Parker and this defense. And can you win on turnovers, be competitive on the ground, and make a big play or two? That's my ultimate key. Can they get a big play or two through the air? I don't think Iowa can win this game without hitting on at least a play or two over the top. And man beaters aren't always over the top, but they've got to create some sort of explosive play through the air. I really do believe that against this Ohio State team. I don't think we can expect them to win a game like they did in the second half against Minnesota. Not against this team. Too much talent. But I went through position by position with Mark yesterday, and ended up tallying up Ohio State 5, Iowa 4. Those numbers representing who we favor as it relates to certain position battles. So maybe not as lopsided with the starters as one would expect. I think Iowa's probably got a better special teams unit. They got a better linebacking core, got a better offensive line. Ohio State's receivers are a lot better. Will Howard's better than Cade McNamara. I think we can all agree on that. Running back is probably closer than we would have thought heading into the season. I'd probably give Iowa the nod at tight end, so maybe not as far-fetched as one would think, but it's always tough against this team because they're so deep, they're so good, they're so explosive, and it's on the road in the horseshoe. But if Iowa wins this game, it's a resume builder. Obviously, then we're talking playoff aspirations. I think we could still talk playoff aspirations, even though some people think I'm crazy for bringing that up. With the schedule ahead, we can talk about that after the game. But if they win this one, holy cannoli, then we're looking at a real chance at Iowa making the playoff, assuming everything doesn't fall apart, because they have a very, very favorable month of October and month of November ahead. We'll talk to you after the game. Myself, Coach Patterson, Don Patterson, talking with you live, taking calls, taking comments, and giving our breakdown of the game live. The kick at 2:30 p.m. Central Time on CBS. Coach Patterson and I right here from the Hawkeye of the Storm immediately to follow. We'll talk to you Saturday.